was a joke. A Kentucky Fried Chicken joke. Talking big game, flapping my gums. Never got around to getting nothing done. I was a freak. Couldn't even get along with the other geeks. I was so sure things would go my way. I always got rolled by the end of the day. I was alone. I was afraid. Tired of nothing working out my way. I wanna make it happen.
I Hate Politics is a podcast dedicated to exploring a human activity we love to hate. We look at human life, culture, and economics closest to us, in our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and in our local governments. Together, we will explore how politics is central to getting things done in societies where we treasure diverse views and preferences. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. I've spent my life studying politics, and I know this. Unless we want to live in a dictatorship or monarchy, we are stuck with politics. Politics is more than Trump, Biden, or elections. It's how we fix potholes, make our streets safer, where we put our schools, and decide who goes to them. It's about coming together as a community. It's about us. Let's go find those stories. As the 2021 school year ends, we have been looking at education from various angles. This week, I talked with longtime education reporter and Montgomery County journalist Karin Chenoweth, whose new book, Districts That Succeed: Breaking the Correlation Between Race, Poverty, and Achievement, came out in May from Harvard Education Press. She is the writer-in-residence at the Education Trust, a national education nonprofit. Districts That Succeed is the fifth in a series that began in 2007 as Karin and Education Trust sought to find public schools that succeed despite the odds, high rates of poverty, majority black and brown students, and financial constraints. To this list now we can add the pandemic. I also speak with Jerome Price, who teaches history in Richard Montgomery High School, a marquee public school in the Washington, D.C. region. From Mr. Price's point of view, the logistical problems of returning to school were handled much better than the reckoning over race that he sees as being part of the pandemic as well. In this episode, we use music from the Airport 77s, a 70s power pop and classic new wave band from Silver Spring. Andy Sullivan on vocals and guitar, Chuck Dolan on bass, and John Kelly on drums. Their newest album, Rotation, is available on Spotify. If you want to showcase your music on the podcast or know someone else who does, please email us at ihppod@gmail.com. In the news this week, former Democratic National Committee Chair, Labor Secretary, and Montgomery County Council member Tom Perez announced that he was running to be governor of Maryland. The Democratic field is now quite crowded. The Washington Post reported that former Education Secretary John King had raised over $1 million since announcing in May. Maryland Comptroller Peter Francho has over $2 million in the bank. Prince George's County politician Russian Baker and nonprofit executive Wes Moore have also announced there are other lesser-known candidates. In the county, Gaithersburg City Council member Lorianne Sales has filed to run for an at-large county seat. Will Roberts, former legislative director for Jamie Raskin, seems ready to run in District 2, which is an open seat with Craig Rice, term limited, and is being contested as well by Marilyn Balcombe. There is one open at-large seat being vacated by Hans Riemer, who is term limited. The other three incumbents, Evan Glass, Gabe Albornoz, and Will Joando, are running for re-election. Brandy Brooks, Kristen Mink, Kim Kellerman, and now Sales are all running for at-large as well. In Nancy Navarro's seat in District 4, former delegate Marise Morales and county Planning Commission Vice Chair Natalie Fanny Gonzalez are running against each other. County Council member Hans Riemer has announced his candidacy to run for county executive. On June 12th, he set himself apart from incumbent Mark Elrich with a yes speech.
A candidate who wants to say yes. I want to say yes to economic development and bringing jobs to this county and bringing high-paying jobs from amazing companies here so that our kids can have a chance to live here. I want to say yes to that. I want to say yes to housing. I want to say yes to housing in our backyards. I want to say yes to housing. Yeah. I want to say yes to housing for millennials. Yeah. I want to say yes to the missing middle. I want to say yes for housing for the workforce that we need to power our future in this county.
Yes.
I want to say yes to zoning reform. It's been an invisible barrier for 100 years. I want to say yes to solar. I want to power this county with clean, renewable energy. I want to say yes to technology. How can we hope to attract technology companies if we can't say yes to technology? I want to say yes to the Purple Line in all of its glory. I want to say yes to police reform and police-free schools. I want to say yes to universal after-school programs for every kid so that every kid has a chance to live a better life. And I want to say yes to jobs and development in the East County, which was shut down for decades and left behind. I want to say yes to our future. And that's really what this is about. It's about building opportunity. It's about this county reaching higher.
Pride Month is almost over. The parades are done. The costumes are mostly put away for next year. Erin Reed takes stock of what Pride felt like this year.
Hello, my name is Erin Reed. I live in the Washington, D.C. area, and I am active in trans rights and LGBTQ equality causes. This year has not been a good year for LGBTQ people, even in spite of Pride, and it makes it hard to celebrate. Over 250 laws have been proposed targeting trans kids, trans adults, and homeless and disadvantaged trans populations. In many states, these laws have passed. This is the most amount of laws ever proposed in a single year against LGBTQ people. Some of these laws include sports bans that have passed in many states, such as Arkansas, Tennessee, Florida. Also include bans on transgender health care for trans youth populations. So in the state of Arkansas, for instance, many teenagers are being withdrawn from their hormones and forced to detransition in front of their peers. In Tennessee, there are signs that have gone up warning people about transgender people within restrooms. Even here in Falls Church, Virginia, a judge ordered a Northern Virginia school system to reinstate a suspended gym teacher who had a policy of misgendering trans students on purpose. Our allies need to do more to pressure the change of these laws and to pressure more focus on trans equality. The number one thing that allies can do is facing these issues head on in their communities, making sure that those who misgender trans people and those who hold bigoted opinions of trans people are not welcome. We cannot allow these views to become mainstream. Likewise, we need to make sure that our politicians are aware of these issues and fight for things like the Equality Act, tooth and nail.
Almost on cue, in Loudoun County, a school board meeting broke out in chaos, and one person was arrested over a draft policy that would require the school system to provide transgender students facilities and activities consistent with their gender identity, including requiring teachers to address transgender students by their names and pronouns of choice. Virginia state law requires the state's public school systems to develop new policies applicable to transgender students. In transportation news, the Hogan administration is saying that the opposition to toll lanes on 270 means no new American Legion Bridge because the state won't get the $6 billion in private investments towards the bridge. In Washington, D.C., a pedestrian bridge collapsed over Interstate 295, injuring 6 people and shutting down the highway. The infrastructure bill cannot come fast enough. One correction from last week, I had said that the minor league restructuring had cut out the Frederick Keys. It's the Hagerstown Suns that was cut out, not the Frederick Keys. The Frederick Keys, Bowie Bay Sox, and other regional minor league teams have seen a revenue hit and a loss of support from Major League Baseball. It's still all tragic because Major League Baseball has the deep pockets to adequately nurture its farm systems. I'll be back with education journalist and author Karin Chenoweth. Karin Chenoweth, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, congratulations on this is the fifth book in the series, Districts That Succeed. I devoured it over the weekend and I have questions.
Oh, I'm so excited.
Why did you go from looking at schools to looking at districts? Why did that unit of analysis change for you?
Over the years, I would write about a really high-performing school or a rapidly improving school, and the principal would get another job at the district level or somewhere in another district, or he or she would retire, and the school would fall apart. And the unit that chooses who the principals are is the school district. That's the superintendent or the assistant superintendent that actually chooses principals, hires them, places them, supports them, or undermines them. And very often districts undermine principals. And so I wanted to just get a sense of what does it look like to be a functional district, to be a district that does not undermine principals. So that's why I started to look at districts. I think I identified 5 really interesting districts, very different from each other, but they all share certain kinds of things that I call an ethos, where it is incumbent on every adult to be instructionally effective for students.
So you mentioned that, districts choose principals, right? And in your marquee example, the Chicago Public School, there has been a constant change in the leadership, like a really troublesome time in the period where schools seem to have improved. So how does really district matter?
Well, I mean, Chicago's this really, really interesting case where for the most part, I would say it really matters who the superintendent is, really matters who the district leadership is. In Chicago, maybe not so much. Part of the reason is they have radically decentralized in some ways. In 1988, the Chicago School Reform Act created a school board for every single school in Chicago. So at that point, it was like 520 schools. And each school has an elected school board that consists of parents, community members, staff members, teachers, and at the high school level, a student. So you've got this radical decentralization coupled with mayoral control, which controls certain kinds of things. But there's been a citywide acknowledgement, understands that the power of principals to drive improvement is huge. And so you've got the local school councils, these school boards choosing principals, but they have to choose them from among the pool that has been developed by the district. Developed and approved by the district. So they have to have certain kinds of qualifications. So Chicago has really made this a real focus, and it's become a focus not just of the district, but also of this very decentralized group of parents, community members.
If you look at the other examples that you provide, other case studies, right? They all emphasize continuity of leadership, particularly of the superintendent. And suddenly we have a counter case of Chicago saying, oh, it doesn't matter how many superintendents come and go. So in 4 cases, we have the superintendent being very important. And in the 5th case, we're like, no, they're not important. The principals are important. So with this, then how does your unit of analysis really work?
It seems to me that the important thing is to take from this book is that you don't need to have a single kind of context. Chicago has a very unusual it has a unique context. So does Cottonwood, Oklahoma. Correct. So does Valley Stream 30. They're all unique contexts, and yet they all were able to improve. They all took the resources that they had available to them. They took the context within which they operate and made it work for them.
Through reading your book, the book that it most reminded me of was Machiavelli. And, Machiavelli says at one point, a good army...
Just register my face as surprised.
Well, so Machiavelli says, a good army can get all the gold it wants. And you argue that a well-organized school, and sometimes a district, can find the resources to make things happen. A large number of the great initiatives in the 5 districts you mentioned are grant-driven, are driven by these partnerships with nonprofit organizations or the University of Chicago or, the University of Illinois at Chicago. Is that your basic argument, that a well-organized school and a well-organized district will find the resources necessary to bring to the kids and thereby become successful?
Well, I would say that the successful schools I have studied and districts that I have studied have managed to marshal additional resources. I don't know that I would say the opposite. In other words, just because you're well organized doesn't mean you're able to find those resources. Over the course of the 16 years I've been doing this, there have been schools and districts that have been starved of resources, and they've done the best they can with the resources they have. They shouldn't have to be doing this. Like Sharon Holcomb in Lane, Oklahoma, she is constantly writing grant proposals, which takes her away from her core work. And she says, I shouldn't have to be doing this just to get some books for my kid, for the kids. And she shouldn't. So it's not an argument that, oh, well, everybody needs to be on their own and just, applying for grants. I would hate that to be something that people came away with. I will say this, though. I think when school districts improve, it becomes easier for them to get the resources they need. So, for example, Seaford, Delaware, which is one of the districts I profile, Seaford, Delaware had not had a bond passed in many, many years until it finally showed some improvement. When a community sees improvement and says, oh, okay, it's not just money down a rat hole. Yeah, we'll up the millage, or we'll pass a bond. I've seen that happen often enough that I do think one of the ways schools and districts can get more resources is by improvement and not waiting for the resources in order to improve.
But don't you think that's a little bit of a chicken and egg?
Yeah, a little bit. But it just is what it is. I think we're now in a situation where there are forces that are saying don't give money to schools. And schools, in order to make the case that they need more money, actually have to improve before they get that money. That's not ideal, but I think that's politics.
Okay, maybe this brings us to the LBJ paradox that you started the book with. What is the Lyndon Johnson paradox in education?
So one of the things I argue is that public schools and democracy are intimately intertwined. John Dewey explicated this at great length.
Yes.
Horace Mann, But we as a nation, and I think this has really come to the fore in the last year or so as an issue, we as a nation have not been fully committed to democracy. And so we haven't been committed to a full public school system that educates all children. After the Civil War, we had Reconstruction, which was a real attempt to build a democracy. And for the first time, African-American politicians had some power. And almost the first thing they did was establish schools for all kids, Black kids, white kids, Native kids. They didn't have Hispanic kids. They didn't have, like those were the kids, all kids who lived in those states and localities. And they established the school tax to pay for them. In the counter-revolution that happened, where the white aristocracy organized militias and took back power from this fledgling democracy, the first thing they did was burn the schools and murder the teachers and principals. So you can see this very intimate connection between schools and democracy. The next real time that we really attempted a true democracy was with the Voting Rights Act, which then kind of enforced the 15th Amendment, the 14th Amendment. And the president who pushed and pulled and cajoled and bullied, and he got the Voting Rights Act, he got the Civil Rights Act, he got the Fair Housing Act, he got all these pro-democracy, all this pro-democracy legislation with the advocacy of the civil rights movement at his back, of course. He knew that schools made kids smarter and that public schools were part of democracy. He needed the intellectual justification for this. So he hired a social scientist, James Coleman, and he said, go, figure out the effect of schools. And his assumption was that James Coleman would demonstrate that schools make kids smarter. And instead, Coleman established for the first time, using a huge data set that had never been put together before this time. In 1966, he came out with this report that the effect of family background on student achievement seems to be larger than the effect of schools. That wasn't a definitive thing, and he identified there seemed to be some schools that had a bigger effect than others, but the effect of the Coleman report was to convince people that schools didn't matter, that kids brought with them whatever smarts they had, and it didn't really matter what the schools did. It's the family, and the background. Well, this is incredibly discouraging for educators, right? Like educators go in thinking, I'm gonna help kids. And then they're basically told, not so much. You can do a little on the edges, you can pull a few kids out and save them, but on the whole, you're not going to do much. So that's really discouraging. And it had the effect of undermining public education. And so it gave ammunition for those people who want to undermine democracy to say, well, it doesn't really matter. School taxes, they're oppressive. Taxation is oppressive. It's confiscatory. We shouldn't have to pay for other children to not learn anything. We'll just give me the money and I'll educate my own kids. That is not a democracy building agenda. And Johnson knew that. The minute he saw that report, I think he probably knew it. He tried to bury it, didn't work. It's probably the most, I would say, the most profoundly effective piece of social science. It's had enormous ramifications.
One of the things that you mention as part of a successful district and school is involved families. So the homeschool partnership, I think Coleman mentioned it as well as Rudder, you talk about in the book. I didn't see very much discussion about the homeschool partnership in your book. Did you come to a conclusion that it did not matter? What was your view on that?
So over the years, I've seen some schools and districts really pay a lot of attention to the homeschool partnership, and they will say, it's very important. But I've seen others where they say, well, our parents are working 2 shifts a day. They can't be involved. We don't ask much of them because they don't really understand American schooling. So we'll try and explain it, and we try and include them, but we're not really looking to them to do a whole lot. So that has made me think, it's fungible. Like, it's not that it's not important. It can be important, but it's not actually an absolute requirement. One of the things that has come out of the COVID era is that teachers have seen kids' homes, and they've seen how kids' families do support them, but not in traditional ways. They'll never come to a PTA meeting. Don't ask them to. They may not even come to a curriculum night. Don't judge them on that. But that doesn't mean they're not supporting their kids in the ways that they can. But they may, there are a lot of parents who are very supportive of their kids, but they didn't have good experiences in school. They're not coming to the school building. Just if you want to see them, you might need to go to their homes or their churches or their, the firehouse down the street. They're not coming to the school. But teachers have started to see, and I've heard from a lot of teachers and principals that, I didn't think our parents were all that supportive. Turns out they are. They're very supportive.
Where do you think we in Montgomery County stand with respect to being a district that succeeds?
It wouldn't be on my list of school districts to study. Its gaps in achievement are tremendous. And I was just looking at some of the data. It is not marshaling its full power. See, Montgomery County, enormous resources, enormous wealth. There's no resource reason that every Montgomery County school can't be a fabulous school. The resources are not the issue. What you're left with is kind of a belief gap. And there is a tradition in Montgomery County. Well, I hope it's better than when my kids went through school. My kids are both, young adults in the workforce. So they graduated in 2004 and 2007. So, quite a while ago. But I could see as they went through the school system that the belief among teachers, principals, the district level leadership was there are just going to be a lot of kids who aren't going to succeed. My kids would succeed because they were white girls. There was a principal of a middle school in Montgomery County, and I saw him do this. And he said, "Thank God for our white girls, because if we didn't have them, we'd really look like a terrible school." Right. I mean, that was the standard. He said it publicly. It wasn't like a little hidden thing. It was a public statement. And you could, when somebody says something like that publicly, it's part of a culture of what was being expected of students in Montgomery County. And it's hard to believe that it's vastly different now. Maybe it is. That would be nice.
So how can we get to the place where it is incumbent, or let me read this out to you. It is incumbent on all personnel to be instructionally effective for all pupils. How do we get there?
How do we get there? This is a leadership question, and Montgomery County has good principals, it has mediocre principals, it has crummy principals, right? like there is a whole bell curve of principals. But it has not as a district, but that's kind of the randomness. It has not as a district really focused on how it's going to recruit, hire, select, place. It's very dependent on individual assistant superintendents and, you know, what their networks are. In fact, one of the things that I have done is be an observer over many years of a grant that the Wallace Foundation gave to 6 large districts in the country to improve their principal pipeline process. So the principal pipelines that produce actual principals sitting in principal seats, and, you know, from the recruitment to the training to the hiring to the placement to the evaluation and support. And these were 6 large districts, and what became clear is all of them, and I suspect Montgomery County is right in there with this, all of them had rather random selection processes. It was very much, you know, somebody's retiring. I know somebody else has been an assistant principal for a while, so let's get him in the, you know, let's get him.
Well, that's not quite
doing it.
correct, actually. So they do have these slates that they maintain. They have a fairly strong principal internship program. They have a community members on their selection board.
I've been on those selection boards.
Exactly.
Have you been on those selection
Yeah, I've been
boards?
on the selection boards. But in paper, they have everything that you have identified.
Right. But have they demonstrated improvement? Have they demonstrated that they have led improvement? That they have led adults in improvement?
But there's a problem here, right? That goes back to the LBJ paradox, right? So when you don't have improvement, you can say, oh, the home situation is so bad, is that, and therefore we don't have improvement. And then you have COVID and you go, okay, the home situation just got worse, and so therefore we don't have improvement. So it's very hard to hold anybody accountable in particular principles, because there is no clear measure by which to hold principals accountable.
So, I mean, this is, if you see student achievement as the question of whether students achieve as solely lying within them as human individuals, we can't solve this problem. If we see it as an institutional response to student need, then we can start solving the problem. And this was the big insight that the University of Chicago Consortium of School Research provided, right? When they were studying high school dropouts, everybody thought this was a function of personal, something personal that the kids brought. You know, either the girls would get pregnant or the boys would get in trouble with the law, or they really, you know, hadn't been prepared for high school. When they actually studied the kids who dropped out, none of that was true. And what they saw was that different schools had different effects on high school dropout rates. And that meant once you can marshal the institutional response, so as long as your response is, well, you know, the kids are poor, the parents don't help with the homework, you know, what do you expect us to do? As long as that's the response and not, oh, okay, well, that didn't work, what else can we do? But here in Montgomery County, and this is why I say, like, come on, Montgomery County. I mean, I've been in schools where they have almost nothing. Any school in Montgomery County would be a wealthy school in some of the districts I've been in. So what's their excuse?
Yep.
Like when George Hall Elementary School in Mobile, Alabama, serving a very poor population of students, very marginalized, you know, extremely marginalized students, and they're up at the top of Alabama. What's Montgomery County's excuse? I don't, you know, like, There's no excuse.
Karin Chenoweth, thank you for coming on I Hate Politics. Karin's book is called Districts That Succeed: Breaking the Correlation Between Race, Poverty, and Achievement. It's out from Harvard Education Press. I'll be back with MCPS history teacher Jerome Price. Jerome Price, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Thanks for having me, Sunil.
So you recently returned to the school building after months of being outside. What were your expectations as you were coming back?
So I had a few expectations before returning to school during the pandemic. One dealt with how we were preparing the building for the day we would inevitably, return. So safety was a big one for me. I expected that our building would be ready to handle the groups of students and staff returning to the building. I expected for there to be solid school procedures that enforce social distancing protocols throughout our building. I expected school community members to know who they could contact if concerns or questions ever arose regarding safety. We were also witnessing and living through a period of racial reckoning, right? A moment that wasn't certainly new for folks who know history, but one that was certainly monumental. So the pandemic, coupled with social media, forced us to deal with the legacy of our country's original sin. And that was a positive. But I did expect for mindsets to shift concerning education on race in this country. It was Maya Angelou who said, when you know better, you do better. How could we as a nation experience what had happened, right? Breonna Taylor, Maud Arbery, George Floyd, Christian Cooper just wanting to birdwatch and even a Rockville protest and not be changed. So I was expecting to see change in that area too, and I was hungry for it, right? The reality was that our school buildings services team did a phenomenal job, right? Preparing our building. And I'm sure the same is true for many other schools in the county. Sadly, I don't think we've made enough progress in the realm of race in this country. There continues to be a lot of resistance to fundamental change that we need to see in schools. And that involves policy as well as mindsets.
I'm trying to get a sense of whether you thought the physical safety aspects and the racism aspects were related in some ways, or were they completely different to you?
They were completely related to one another, right?
How so?
The virus, I think, exposed the racial divisions in this country. I mean, you look at it right now, when we see students returning to the building, everyone's not back in the building, right? Majority of the students who are back in buildings are white students compared to students of color. That's just one example that speaks volumes to me as a teacher who teaches in the school district that's considered one of the most diverse in the country, right? So they're intertwined, and I don't think you can separate the two. Some folks may want to, but I think they go hand in hand.
All right, I want to talk about rethinking what you teach. Traditionally, you're given a syllabus to teach from. And then when you take that syllabus and you reprioritize, what are you putting on top? What are you putting on the bottom? It's clear that you want relevance on top, but what are you putting on the bottom?
Traditionally, you would see, classes start with, you just immediately go back in time, right? I started with the current year, 2021, right? And I spent a couple of weeks going through with my students moments that they've witnessed on TV or literally a part of, right? In terms of the protests in Rockville. I had student leaders who were registered as students in my class, actually the 3 students who organized that protest, present and share their experiences, right? And have that moment inform everything they were going to learn throughout the semester. So we were going back to that and saying police brutality, right? I mean, talk about the 1960s and 1970s, Black Panthers, Black Power movement. I mean, you name it, they're directly linked. Students are saying, Mr. Price, this platform sounds like it could be, I had a student say, Mr. Price, this platform looks like it could live today and stand. And that's the power in that, when you really force students to look at the present and the past in a history class. I always taught Emmett Till, right? From Chicago, this young teenager from Chicago goes to Money, Mississippi, and is brutally murdered just because of the color of his skin. But this year, I intentionally made more connections to today. And students, I had students yesterday. I did my end of the semester evaluations, and they were referencing Emmett Till and saying that was probably the most powerful lesson that they learned all year long.
You said that white students returned to the school building at higher rates than other groups. So is that true of your African-American history course as well?
So majority of the class, I would say, is probably African-American. In terms of the numbers of kids who returned to I saw, it was probably 50-50. It was even.
And was that a teaching moment for you?
Oh yeah. I mean, I knew it before returning. We actually talked about it during a staff meeting. I'm part of the staff learning team at my high school, and we actually spent a staff meeting talking about the pandemic and the data concerning race and the numbers and the percentages and the fact that most of the students returning would be white. So I had an idea. I knew that. But seeing it was interesting though, because I've been at my school for a little while. And
that's exactly what I'm asking.
You don't, it's the data is one thing, but actually seeing it play out in person is pretty interesting. And no one said anything about it in the building. You're just experiencing it. And I thought it was just, it was pretty powerful. I don't know. I don't have the words though. It was something that.
Something, right? African-American history class with majority African-American students, suddenly the color changes when they return from pandemic.
Yeah.
So how are you thinking about your teaching, your student learning in the future? There's a layer to this, right? And the layer to my mind is also about the fact that we emphasize STEM, math, and science education so much, often to the detriment of what you teach, history, civics, relevance, right? And it is the case that your course and courses like yours provide that connection that young people have to school, while they may feel disconnected in a physics class or a math class. There is no way that you can be disconnected about about a lesson on Emmett Till, right? And so, that balance, do you think that'll shift back towards STEM education as we move away from the pandemic?
I hope not. I mean, it's why history is the most important subject there is. The humanities, I mean, students need to be able to read, think critically, debate, have discussions about what's happening in the world. And if they're not having those discussions, if they're not a part of it, if they're not thinking and rethinking the lessons of the past, then I don't know what kind of country we're going to have, right? You need that in your schools. And so I don't think we were at a place where all the attention was necessarily on STEM programs, but I do think that more emphasis should be put on the humanities, history in particular, for students, because they're witnessing it, they're seeing, I mean, when you talk about policies and their lives, being impacted by decisions made by folks who were generations apart from them, they need to know what's at stake. And you don't just automatically gain that, right? You have to get the tools. And that's what happens in a history classroom or an English classroom, for example. And I mean, that's why I feel so passionately about this.
Well, outside school buildings, there's a movement to criticize critical race theory, even in Montgomery County, as liberal as it is. And the charge is made that, history and social science teachers are teaching critical race theory, and somehow that is taking away from real education about math and physics and, and other stuff. How do you sort of combat that? I know what your response is to it, but how do you actually, muster to combat that?
Well, first off, I'm not sure what real education means. I take it as understanding, right, as a history teacher, the history of this country. And the fact is, our country was founded on freedom and slavery. Imagine that, the irony. That's our starting point. For so long, that's not been the narrative that students have heard in classrooms, right? And so whether you call it critical race theory or just history, students need to know it. They need to engage in the text. They need to learn about key players, key people. They need to know that their lives are not that much different, right, than a young Dr. King, Malcolm X, Fannie Lou Hamer, Dolores Huerta, right? They need to know that those folks walked in their shoes. And if we're refusing to acknowledge that and teach that, I think it's a disservice to not just the students who we're teaching now, but to our country, because there's an awareness that's lost. And there's a consciousness that students are not going to be able to tame. They need to know. And so as a teacher in the classroom, it's my responsibility to equip students and give them the tools that they need.
What kind of support do you need going forward? Where do you think you're lacking? And what can the community, the school board, or your school administration, what do you need?
So schools need to practice what they preach. If we are to build a culture of anti-racism, some folks may say equity, equality, fairness, right? We have to continue those tough conversations after the school year. It can't stop in June on the last day of school. This is the reality. White supremacy is real. Institutional racism is real. And they have had a devastating legacy in our schools. So we have to do the work and equip our teachers and staff to take these lessons learned, these conversations, these personal stories shared into their own individual classrooms and not allow themselves to forget those people when they are interacting and working with their students and colleagues. Anti-racism isn't a conversation. We just have in a staff meeting.
Jerome Price, thank you for coming on I Hate Politics. I know the conversation doesn't stop on the last day of school, but I hope you have a restful summer.
Thanks so much. Same to you.
What lessons can we draw from my conversation with Karin Chenoweth and Jerome Price? First, Karin Chenoweth's pursuit of finding school districts that succeed found some unique cases by her own admission. The common thread between them is really their success, not necessarily what made them successful. Karin does not spend time in her book on the school board, which is supposed to be the body governing most school districts. By implication, district leadership then means the superintendent, and in 4 of her 5 cases, district superintendents appear to have made a difference, but not in Chicago, the only large school district in the book. This presents a circularity problem. We know a district is successful only when it is successful. Karin responds to this criticism with a political answer, perfectly in line with the theme of this podcast. Well-organized and well-led schools and districts go out and find resources. She admits this is less than ideal, but points out that even public dollars for public schools are dependent on the school system showing improvement. Faced with ideological opposition to taxation and public education, public school and district leaders have to find a way to show progress, or they will be denied resources. That's the reality she sees. I see Karin's book in a long line of writing that has emphasized organizational capacity over resources. This is the meaning of Machiavelli's words that say that a good army can get all the gold it wants, and the explanation for how little Vietnam stalled the mighty American war machine 50 years ago. The relative role of organization and resources is not an either-or issue. Successful organizations, whether military or in education, need both. The question is really about which begets the other. The reason I wanted to talk to Jerome Price was to understand how he managed the move away from and back to in-person teaching. But what I got instead was something much deeper and more moving. Our conversation centered instead on how we as a society deal with and teach students about structural racism, and given the growing controversy over critical race theory, his view from inside the classroom carries particular weight. As a county and a public school system in Montgomery County, we have not adequately dealt with the issue of race and racism in our schools. Yes, MCPS is conducting an anti-racism audit, but all of that seems like conferencing while we have to put out a fire. When students returned to his African American history course, the color of the class had changed. There were fewer minority students who returned in proportional terms. That has to be a sobering moment. As the national debate over critical race theory heats up, Jerome Price's approach to teaching history is going to come under scrutiny, and it'll be a measure of our mettle in Montgomery County and Maryland to see him prevail. That's all for this episode. We used music from the Airport 77s, a Silver Spring power pop band, Andy Sullivan on vocals and guitar, Chuck Dolan on bass, and John Kelly on drums. Their newest album, Rotation, is available on Spotify. I'm very much looking forward to showcasing local talent, and especially local music students, on the podcast. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email us at ihppod@gmail.com or reach out on Twitter at ihppod. I hope you will subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and your home. See you next time.
Tip the valet when you showed up late for ballet. Your daughter's hair, it wasn't in a bun. You haven't spent a single day fundraising for the PTA. You let your children play with water guns. Ever since you moved to town, our bond rating's been going down. We've got spray that